They sold her like a mule gone lame. No name, no past, just dust on her shoulders and silence in her eyes. Then a man stepped out from the edge, weather-worn and quiet, trading a string of dried fish for nothing but her dignity. He didn't promise a future, just a place to sit, breathe, and not be owned. And somehow, that was enough to make her stay. Part 1. Cold air and a look that didn't turn away. The sun had barely cracked the ridge when they brought her out. She stood like a shadow against the frost-hardened dirt, her shoulders squared not out of pride, but habit, the kind of posture you learn when you've had to brace against too many words hurled like stones. Her boots didn't match in size or color. The coat hung from her frame like it once belonged to someone who believed in better winters. She didn't cry, didn't tremble, didn't meet the eyes of the men who gathered like buzzards with coin in their palms and chewing tobacco on their lips. Dust swirled around her ankles. Wind caught in her skirts. The auctioneer shouted something about work ethic and obedience. A joke landed somewhere in the crowd. Laughter followed. It scraped the walls of her ribs like a rusted nail. She had a name once, maybe still did, but out here names didn't buy shelter. What she had was silence, and a spine that hadn't bent even when it cracked. Then someone at the back shifted. He wasn't bidding, wasn't even watching like the others, just standing there in a faded shirt, sleeves rolled past his elbows, a rawhide string in his hand with 3 fish hanging from it, dried, salted, hardened by wind. When the bidding stalled, no one willing to pay more for a girl, with nothing left but dirt under her nails, he walked forward. Didn't say a word, just held out the string of fish, let it dangle in front of the auctioneer, and then looked at her. It wasn't pity in his eyes or hunger, just stillness, like he'd seen enough winters to know what worth looked like when it was covered in bruises. The auctioneer laughed. "Ain't taking fish for a trade, mister." The man didn't blink, didn't smile, just stood there until someone in the back muttered, "Hell, give her to him. Ain't like she got anywhere else to go." And so they did. The girl didn't move at first, not until he nodded once, real slow, not a command, not a promise, just a gesture that said, "There ain't no chains here, but there is a fire that still burns." She followed. No one stopped her, no one cheered, but someone behind them, someone who'd been halfway through a bottle, paused just long enough to set the cork back in. Part 2, not for free and not to own. The wind had shifted by the time they left the edge of that dust-bitten yard. The sun, low and amber, had lost its heat, and the breeze it left behind threaded cold fingers down her spine. She didn't shiver, didn't speak. The man with the fish string didn't offer words either. He simply untied his gelding, a tall roan with one cracked hoof and a left ear that twitched more than it should, and swung a saddlebag over the horn. He didn't help her mount. He didn't reach out, didn't gesture, just stepped into the stirrup, swung his leg over, and turned the roan's head east, towards open land that rolled, bare and watchful, like the silence between them. She followed on foot, not because she was told, not because she was bound, because there was nowhere else to go. Her boots, handed down or stolen, weren't the same size. The left one slipped at the heel, the right bit into her instep. Every few hundred steps she shifted, trying to even her stride. The rope belt around her waist had frayed ends. The dress, well, calling it that was a courtesy. It was more patch than cloth, more memory than comfort. But still she walked, her eyes steady on the trail the roan left behind. The saddle creaked with a rhythm that was almost human, not unlike the voice of a tired man muttering to himself. It had the sound of old leather straining under more than weight. She listened to it the way a lonesome child listens to night sounds, not for meaning but for company. Now and then he looked back, just over his shoulder, a quick glance, not to see if she'd run, not to see if she kept pace, just to see if she was still there. By the time the sun tucked itself behind the far hills, the shadows were long and the road was empty. He dismounted without a word and led the roan to a dry patch beneath a knotted pinyon tree, pulled the reins loose and let the horse drink from a battered canteen. He didn't offer her water, but he set the canteen down, close enough for her to take it if she wanted. She waited, counted heartbeats, then stepped forward and drank. She'd learned enough in this world to know the worst men made kindness loud, so everyone saw it. The dangerous ones were quiet when they meant harm. This one, he was just quiet, and she was too tired to guess what that meant. They didn't light a fire. The cold rose in waves from the ground, curling up her legs, settling in the hollow beneath her ribs. She didn't ask for a blanket. She didn't ask anything. She sat with her knees pulled up beneath her chin, arms looped tight around her shins, like she'd been holding herself together for years and didn't trust anyone else to do it. When the moon rose high and white above the low pines, he unfolded a saddle blanket and laid it across her shoulders. Still said nothing. She didn't thank him, didn't smile, but she didn't shrug it off either. That was something. In the still dark, while his breath slowed to the rhythm of sleep, she reached into the inner seam of her coat, beneath the lining near the torn edge, and pulled out a scrap of paper, crinkled, yellowed, edges scorched. The words were still there, barely. Promise of union until death or desertion. No names, just marks, hers and a man who never looked her in the eye again after signing it. She held it like a bruise you press just to make sure it still hurts, then folded it again, slipped it back where it lived, in that pocket where her hand always drifted when she was afraid. At dawn he stirred first, rose slow like a man who didn't owe time anything. She watched him roll up the blanket, tie it back beneath the saddle, and rub the roan's neck once. Not soft, not rough, just knowing. He mounted without looking at her, nudged the horse forward. She fell in behind. The wind was quieter that morning, and for the first time in weeks, her shoulders didn't curl inward against it. About an hour out, they crossed a dry creek bed. The footing was loose, and she stumbled. Her knee hit a rock hard enough to tear through the cloth. She hissed, pressed her hand to the wound, and stayed crouched. He reined in the roan, dismounted, walked back. She didn't look up. He stood there a beat too long, then pulled a bandana from his back pocket, knelt, and offered it, not with concern, just with presence. She didn't take it right away, didn't move at all. Then, finally, she reached up and took it with the same hand that held the promise paper just hours before. He waited until she tied it off. Then he nodded once and went back to the horse. They moved on. That night they stopped early. He let her ride the last stretch of the day, though the saddle was too wide and the stirrups hung low. Her thighs ached from gripping, but she didn't complain. When she slid down, the ground swayed under her feet, like the world hadn't settled yet. He started a small fire this time, nothing high, just enough for warmth and beans. When he handed her a tin plate, their fingers brushed. He didn't flinch. Neither did she. They ate in silence. That night she slept on the saddle blanket just a few feet closer to the fire, not touching, not trusting, but not afraid anymore either. And in the dark, before the last embers died, her hand drifted to the coat pocket again. But this time, it didn't stop there. She pulled the paper out, tore it once, then again, and tossed the pieces into the fire. The flames hissed, curled them to ash. He never asked what it was. But the next morning he offered her the saddle. And when she climbed up, he didn't look back anymore, because he knew she was still there. Part 3. A House Without Locks. They reached the ranch late on the third day. Not late in hours, but in light. That soft space between dusk and dark, when the sun has already left and the moon hasn't taken full claim. The kind of light that made even the cruelest land look gentle. The horse crested a rise, and below them, a low house settled into the earth like it had been waiting centuries to be noticed. The porch leaned slightly east, like a man with one bad knee. The chimney, stout but patched, breathed the faintest smoke. Old wood or memory, she couldn't tell. There was no fence, no sign to name the place, just stones scattered around the yard laid by some hand long ago, not to keep anything in, only to say, "Here, this is where it begins." He didn't announce anything, just pointed with a tilt of his chin and nudged the gelding forward. She followed. Boots quieter now, rhythm easier. The road had worn her down, but it had also worn something off her. That edge of flinch, that tightness in the throat when silence stretched too long. The space between them was still wide, but it wasn't hostile. He dismounted and tied the horse. She waited. He didn't say a word. Didn't have to. Then he pushed the cabin door open and stepped aside. It was cooler inside than out. The kind of cool that lives in thick walls and old habits. The kitchen took up half the room. Wood stove, iron sink, shelves bowed from years of holding more than they should. A bucket half full sat beneath the window. Beside it, a tin basin, clean. The floor bore boot scuffs and two darker spots near the stove, where someone had once dropped grease and never scrubbed it all the way out. The only sound was the slow tick of a clock that had stopped keeping proper time, but hadn't quit entirely. It ticked out of stubbornness now, like an old man muttering just to hear his own voice. He set down his saddlebag and pointed toward a doorway near the back. Then he stepped outside. No instructions, no rules, just that one motion. That room is yours for now. She stood alone in the kitchen a moment longer, letting the quiet settle into her skin. The room he'd pointed to was small, barely wide enough for the bed and a chest. The window had no curtain, the bed had no pillow. But the blanket was folded, the sheets were clean, and in the far corner, a chipped tin mug rested on the sill. She didn't unpack, didn't have much to unpack anyway, just the old satchel she'd carried since before anyone last called her by name. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the wood creak beneath her. The smell of pine, dry and resin thick, clung to the walls. From somewhere far off, a coyote called. Then silence again. She let herself lie back. The ceiling had one crack that split like a river. It didn't threaten to fall, just reminded you the roof had seen weather. She slept there, not well, not deeply, but she slept without flinching at every sound. The next morning, when she stepped into the kitchen, he was already gone. On the table sat a half loaf of bread and a tin knife. Nothing else. No note, no gesture. She poured water from the bucket into the basin and washed her hands. The water was cold, biting across her knuckles, but it woke something in her, the part that remembered mornings when work wasn't punishment, but purpose. She found a broom tucked beside the woodbox and began to sweep. Not out of duty, just to move. The floorboards groaned where they were supposed to. A good house tells you when you're walking through it. As she cleaned, she found a few details the dusk had hidden. A dent in the wall near the coat hooks, a scrape across the table that curved like a child's attempt at a name, and on the counter next to the flour sack, an old bowl, clean, empty. It hadn't been used in a while. She didn't touch it, but she didn't stop looking at it either. That evening when he returned, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder, the scent of horse and mesquite clinging to his coat. He stepped inside and paused. The floor was clean. The kettle had been filled and set over low heat. A thin curl of steam lifted from it like the smallest signal flag. She didn't greet him, didn't smile, just stood beside the stove, a hand resting lightly on the counter. He nodded once, the kind of nod men gave other men when no more needed saying. They ate bread and drank water. No fire, no talk. But he didn't leave the room when she sat. And she didn't bolt her door that night. She didn't know what she was to him, or what he was to her. But the house, it seemed, wasn't asking for answers, just offering a roof and room enough to breathe. And for now, that was enough. Part 4. A woman who fixed what no one else would. She rose with the light, not because of habit, she hadn't had a proper routine in months, but because something in the house stirred just before the sun, a change in air. The way a room shifts when darkness begins to lift. She sat up, bare feet pressed to wood, blankets still drawn over her shoulders, and listened. Nothing, not even birds yet. But her hands itched. The stove had gone cold overnight. She lifted the lid and saw ash still glowing faint beneath the grate. Not dead, just waiting. She opened the wood box. Inside, dry pine stacked like someone had meant to use it, but never quite got around to it. She built the fire slow. No rush, no smoke, just a steady feed of kindling and breath until the flames licked their way alive. Then she looked for something to do. The shelf near the basin sagged a little in the middle, its nails pulled loose on one end. A spool of twine sat in a drawer beside 3 bent spoons, a jar of cloudy vinegar, and a folded scrap of newspaper from 3 years back. She used the twine to lash the sagging shelf just enough so the bowls wouldn't tip. Not fixed proper, but better. Next came the saddle. It hung on the porch rail, rain-cracked and dry, one stirrup missing its leather binding. She hadn't touched a saddle in months, but her fingers still remembered. She brought it inside, set it on the floor by the hearth, and dug into the satchel she'd never fully unpacked. From its bottom she pulled a tin of lard, half-hardened and old, but not spoiled. With the hem of her shawl she began to rub the leather, slow circles, coaxing life back into something once made to carry men through storms. By the time the sun reached through the eastern window, her hands smelled of pine soot and saddle oil. He hadn't come back yet. She found cornmeal in a jar behind the flour, damp but not moldy. She left the flour be, but tested the cornmeal with a pinch of salt, hot water, and thyme. The fire burned warm now. The kitchen had the smell of old cabins, wood smoke, iron, and something almost sweet underneath, like a memory of food. She didn't hum, didn't speak, but her presence filled the place in a way no voice could. When he returned, just before noon, he stepped onto the porch without announcement. His coat was dark with frost melt. A coil of wire looped over one shoulder, and the faint smell of horse followed him in like a loyal dog. He saw her, bent over the hearth, turning a pan with the edge of a boot heel, careful not to burn the bottom. He didn't say anything. She didn't look up. But when she slid the pan off the heat, she placed a square of cornbread, golden, steaming, on a cracked plate, set it down beside a cup of warm water, and stepped back. Still no words. He took off his gloves, laid them flat on the table like something sacred, sat down, picked up the bread. He bit once, chewed slow, then again. She stood near the counter, not watching directly, but knowing every move. There was no pride in her posture, just a sort of quiet waiting, like a woman who knew how to offer but no longer expected to be received. He didn't compliment, but he ate every crumb. When the plate was clean, he wiped it with a fold of bread crust and left it beside the cup. Then he nodded, once, and left to the barn. Later, she swept again. Not just the floors now, but the porch, where dirt had been tracked and left to settle for who knows how long. She beat the rug hanging on the rail, dusted windows with an old cotton shirt she found stuffed in a drawer. By evening, the place breathed differently, still quiet, still plain, but alive. That night, as the cold came back and the moon rose behind the chimney, she sat alone at the table and ran her thumb along the rim of that clean, empty bowl. She didn't eat again, just stared for a long while. Then gently she slid the bowl closer to the center, aligned it, as if tomorrow someone might sit there. Part 5. A door slam that wasn't just the wind. By the third day, she had started to breathe differently, not fully, not deep, but no longer like a woman always listening for footsteps behind her. She still moved quiet, shoulders rounded, arms close to her sides. But her steps no longer skipped in fear every time the wood creaked. She had, without quite knowing it, begun to expect silence, and that's why the barn door hit her like a shot. It came out of nowhere, a sharp slam, hard and final, the sound of wood hitting metal so sudden and fierce it seemed to split the stillness wide open. She dropped where she stood, fell to the floor with arms wrapped tight around her ribs, head tucked down like she'd done 1,000 times before. It wasn't thinking, it was memory. Memory so fast it moved ahead of breath. Her knees hit wood, her breath caught in her throat, and she waited for the voice, the boots, the curse, the pain. But there was none of it, no storm of rage, no man crossing the room in anger, just boots moving away, slow and steady, and a different sound entirely. 3 sharp taps, hollow wood against wood. She looked up. The man was outside again, stacking another crate in the back of the wagon. He hadn't even seen her fall. And the sound, those 3 taps, they weren't meant to frighten, just signal maybe, or a habit. Still, she didn't get up for a long time. Her hands shook when she did. Her dress had caught a splinter, torn at the hem, but she smoothed it down and stood, one hand on the table for balance. Her legs weren't ready, neither was her heart. That night she couldn't sleep. The bed was warm from the fire she had built herself. The blankets were heavy, the room quiet, but her eyes refused to close. Each time they drifted, a memory surged up. Rough voices, cold straw, the sound of a lock sliding into place. He hadn't touched her, not once, not even spoken much. But something in that silence, the clean kind, not the dark kind, was unfamiliar, and unfamiliar meant danger to someone who'd learned not to trust peace. She turned on her side and stared at the door. Its latch hung loose, uncaught. He had left the lantern burning in the hallway. Not bright, just a sliver of yellow along the floorboards. Enough to see, to know. Enough to say, "You are not hidden here, but neither are you trapped." Her fingers brushed the blanket's edge. The last time she'd slept under anything but sky or rafter, it was in a man's house who told her he'd traded his dog for her. That man had bolted the doors from the outside, thrown scraps through the window, and only unlatched the hinge when someone came by and he needed to show her off. That man was dead now, but fear stayed, longer than bruises. She got up. Barefoot, she walked to the door, hand resting on the edge of the latch, then stopped. She didn't close it, didn't hook the bolt. She stood there, fingers grazing the metal, but she didn't seal herself in. Behind her, the fire popped once, just a pine knot giving way, nothing more. The lantern still burned. She turned back, walked slow, and slid beneath the covers again. Not all the way down, just enough to let the blanket hold her spine. Sleep didn't come, not fully, but she let her eyes close for longer that night than the one before. She let her body lie still, even when the wind pressed against the roof, and when she opened her eyes once, just before dawn, the door was still ajar, the light was still on, and no one had come in. That morning, when she woke with the smell of fresh hay and frost through the window, She didn't jump when a board creaked. Instead, she sat up slow, looked toward the door again, and left it open behind her as she walked to the stove. Part 6. Scars that don't show on skin. She found herself watching him more, not out of suspicion that had burned itself out like a campfire in dry wind, but out of something slower, something quieter. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. He didn't talk much. But there were things that said just as much as words. The way he set his cup down slow and never startled. The way he didn't walk behind her but always beside or ahead. The way he never reached toward her hands but left tools where she could find them. And how, every morning, he brought in 2 logs instead of 1. A habit that made no sense until she realized he was making sure the fire stayed long enough for 2 people, not just 1. She was starting to understand him. Not the whole of him, but the outline. Like tracing ridge lines in the dusk, knowing a mountain's shape before you know its trails. And then, one afternoon, the wind turned sharp from the north, and with it came a chill that clung low to the earth. He'd been chopping wood most of the morning, not in a hurry, just steady, and after lunch he sank into the old rocking chair near the fire. Boots off, hat pushed back, shirt sticking to his shoulders with the weight of work and sweat. She was rinsing out a pan by the basin when she heard the creak of the chair fall silent. Turning, she saw he'd slumped to one side, not fully asleep, but near enough. His shirt had slipped down one shoulder, and there it was, a scar, long and crooked, crossing his back like a path cut with violence. Not the kind made by accident, but the kind given on purpose. It wasn't red or raw, it was old, weathered, but deep, deep enough to have bled a river when it was fresh. She froze. There was a moment, just one, where the girl she used to be would have turned away, afraid of what kind of man carried a wound like that. But she wasn't that girl now. She didn't flinch. Instead, she dried her hands on her apron and walked to the hearth where the kettle sat, steam rising, soft and slow. She picked up a clean rag from the shelf, one she'd stitched herself the night before, and dipped it into the hot water, wringing it out just enough so it wouldn't scald. He stirred, eyes half-lidded, blinking toward the fire. She knelt beside him, not touching, just waiting until his gaze found her face. Then, quietly, she held out the cloth. "Water's near boiling," she said. First full sentence she'd spoken since arriving. He looked at the rag, then at her. His face didn't change much. No surprise, no shift in breath. Just a slow nod, like he understood what was being offered and what wasn't. He took the cloth from her hand without a word, used it to wipe the sweat from the back of his neck, then folded it and placed it on the arm of the chair. She stood slowly and returned to the basin, not looking back. But from that moment, the air between them changed. Not in the way lovers meet or the way strangers circle each other. No, this was quieter, older, the kind of shift that happens when 2 people recognize something true in each other's pain and choose not to run from it. She didn't ask how he got the scar, and he didn't ask how she learned to hold out a cloth without trembling. They didn't need to. That night, as snow whispered along the eaves and the fire crackled low, she placed a second tin cup beside his on the hearth. Then, without explanation, she poured half the hot water into each, dropped in dried mint she'd found in the cupboard. He didn't comment. But when he lifted the cup to his lips, he held it with both hands, like it meant more than warmth. They didn't speak after that. They just sat, side by side, 2 cups between them, and for the first time in years, maybe ever, she realized there were other kinds of silence, not the kind that crushed your ribs or made you feel small. This one had space in it, space for breath, for healing, for staying. Part 7. Even strangers know a horse's name. The pasture stretched east of the house, long and open, with a single cottonwood marking the low dip where the ground held onto water better than most. She hadn't been out that far yet, not because it was forbidden. Nothing in this place ever had been, but because the fence lines hadn't called her name until that morning. Something about the way the air moved, the way the sun was rising low and honest, painting the frost in pale gold. She felt less like she was trespassing now and more like the land had finally acknowledged she was still here. The black horse was already saddled, standing alone by the fence, reins dropped to the earth. She paused halfway through the field and watched. It wasn't fear, not exactly, more like reverence, the way a person stands outside a church door, not sure if they're allowed in. She stepped closer, boots quiet on frozen grass. The horse turned slightly, one dark ear flicking toward her, then back again. The saddle was tilted, cinch, too loose. Whoever had tried last didn't finish the job, or didn't know how. Maybe he had stepped away to fix something. Maybe the horse had shifted, or maybe, just maybe, the animal had been waiting for her. She walked the last few feet slow, one hand extended, palm down. No sugar cubes, no rope, just quiet. "Easy there," she whispered, soft as a prayer. "Ain't gonna hurt you." The horse let her approach, let her place her palm against the side of his neck, let her fingers slide into the coarse black mane, thick with dust and sleep. His body was warm, warmer than she expected, and steady, a kind of strength that didn't need to prove itself. She didn't mean to speak again, but the word came anyway. "Smoke?" The horse blinked once, then huffed through his nostrils. Not a full answer, but not rejection either. Behind her, boots crunched. She didn't turn. "I call him Smoke," she said over her shoulder, voice calm. He came up beside her, not close, but close enough. His eyes studied the saddle, then the reins, then the loose cinch. His hands moved quiet, knotting the rig with a twist she hadn't seen before. "He ain't easy to name," the man said. She nodded, still stroking the horse's neck. "Smoke's not something you catch, but if you ride with it long enough, sometimes it stays." He looked at her then, really looked, not just at her face, but at the way she stood, the way she wasn't afraid of the horse, the way the wind lifted the ends of her hair, and she didn't brush it away. She just let it be. "That's a good name," he said. Figured if he needed one, that might do. The gelding leaned into her fingers just slightly. "You ride?" he asked. She nodded once. "Used to, before." He didn't ask before what. Didn't need to. There were 1,000 kinds of before in this land. Before the debt, before the cuffs, before the name got stripped out of a person's mouth like it didn't matter. "Any saddle'll do," she added, "long as it don't slip and the horse don't bite." He gave her the reins, didn't offer to help her mount. She liked that. With a small grunt, she swung her leg up, not graceful but steady. The horse took a single step, like he'd remembered the rhythm of her weight. Her knees found the saddle grooves like old boots finding worn stirrups. The sky opened above her, wide, honest. She exhaled slow, and for a moment she felt taller than the past. He watched her from the ground, hand resting lightly on the fence post. "You can take him," he said, "if you want." She glanced down. "Not far," she replied. "Just need to see where the land stops pretending and starts showing its real shape." He nodded. That meant yes. She rode out past the cottonwood, not fast, just enough to feel the wind lift through her coat. Smoke moved like the name implied. Smooth, evasive, never all in one place. But beneath her, he was solid. When she looked back, the man was still watching, not controlling, not commanding, just witnessing, as if maybe he needed to see her in motion, to believe she hadn't been broken all the way through. That night when she came in, he had already set 2 bowls on the table, one full, one waiting, and beside her cup, the one she'd placed there herself days ago, was a folded square of canvas. Inside, a saddle blanket, cleaned and patched, no note, no claim, but she ran her fingers across the stitches like they were a language, and she understood every word. Part 8. A man from her past knocked on the wrong door. The knock came after 3 days of thaw. The snow had started giving way to soft ground, and the fence posts finally shed their ice crusts. Birds came back in quiet pairs, more sound than color, fluttering through the bare trees like promises not yet made good. She was kneading dough when it came. Elbows dusted with flour, sleeves pushed back to her forearms. There was coffee warming on the stove, fire banked just right. He had gone to check the south fence, alone. The knock came again, firmer, not a rancher's knock, not the easy rattle of a neighbor or the respectful rhythm of someone passing through. No, this one was 3 beats, calculated, entitled. She didn't move at first. Let the silence stand between them. Then, slowly, she wiped her hands on the apron, reached for the small knife she no longer kept, in her boot but hadn't yet put away. She opened the door a crack. And there he was. Garrett, same hat, same eyes, same cologne trying to cover the rot beneath. He smiled like a man who'd already decided the answer. "Well," he said, voice all mock surprise, "ain't this a fine picture?" She said nothing. "You gonna invite me in?" Still nothing. He shrugged, stepped back like he owned the yard. Behind him was a roan gelding too fine for the man who rode it, tethered, loose to the porch rail. On its saddle, a pouch of papers and a holster, half covered by a wool coat. "I come with business," he added, patting the pouch, "and legal right." She leaned against the door frame, jaw tight. "Paper says you still owe," he said. "That your man, God rest his drunk soul, signed over everything to cover his gambling. You remember that, don't you?" She didn't flinch. "Course you do." He gave a grin like vinegar. "Now I come to collect what's mine." She didn't reach for the knife. She didn't run. She simply opened the door the rest of the way and stepped aside, but not for him. The rancher had returned. Boots quiet, coat dusted with trail. His horse had already been tied at the back post. He'd come in through the rear gate, not rushing, not shouting, just moving like someone who saw everything and needed no introductions. He stopped 3 steps behind Garrett, didn't speak, didn't blink. Garrett turned, surprise flashing across his face like lightning that doesn't quite strike. "Well now," he said, eyes narrowing, "didn't know you had a man." "She doesn't," the rancher said. First words, solid as oak. Garrett gave a little chuckle. "Then you best step aside, cowboy. This here's business between her and me." The rancher didn't move. "This land's hers now?" Garrett asked. "You give her the title? You got that kind of pull?" He didn't answer, just looked at the man with the quiet that made lesser men feel small. Garrett licked his lips. "Listen, I ain't here to cause trouble," he said. "Just come to collect. She's got no right living free. Debt's still owed. Got the court order right here." He reached for his saddle pouch. That's when the rancher stepped forward, not fast, not violent, but with a stillness so sharp it sliced clean. "You brought a pistol with you," the rancher said. Garrett's hand paused. "You came to a woman's door with a claim and a threat. She owes me. She doesn't owe you anything." "She's mine by paper." The rancher's eyes narrowed. "There ain't a piece of paper that makes that kind of claim right." "You think she'll stay with you?" Garrett sneered. "You think a woman like that don't run again? She'll leave you like the rest, like her husband left her." There was a moment, a long one. In that pause, even the birds stopped calling. Then the rancher said evenly, "She was never his to leave." Garrett spat in the dirt. "Keep her then," he said, "but don't say I didn't warn you when she burns the place down behind her." He turned, yanked the reins free, and swung into the saddle in one bitter motion. As he rode off, the woman stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other still gripping that flower-streaked apron like it was armor. The rancher didn't chase Garrett, didn't threaten him, didn't even look after him long. Instead, he stepped to the porch, kicked snow off his boots, and looked at her. Not waiting for thanks, not asking for explanation, just being there, in case she needed someone to lean against who wouldn't collapse under the weight. That night, she swept the same board she'd already cleaned twice. The coffee kettle stayed warm, but the knife she'd almost grabbed stayed on the shelf. For the first time in a long time, she didn't sleep with her boots by the door. Part 9. Old seals on a new piece of paper. The fire had burned low, but neither of them moved to add wood. Outside, the wind whispered through frost-laced pine, tugging at the shutters. Inside, the warmth wasn't just from the coals. It came from stillness, from shared silence not pressed by fear. She sat at the table, hands resting on her knees. He was at the sink, rinsing the coffee pot, methodical. Garrett was gone, but not far, not really. The echo of his words still clung to the corners of the house like soot that wouldn't scrub out with soap. She rose, walked to the shelf above the hearth where he'd placed a carved tin box, the kind folks used to store letters, keepsakes, folded things not meant for daylight. She didn't ask, just opened it. Inside, a single key, a leather strip, and a folded scrap of flannel wrapped tight. She took the flannel bundle and carried it to the table, set it down like a small weight, like a burden she'd carried across too many miles, and finally dared to lay still. When she unwrapped it, the paper inside was yellowed and soft at the creases. The ink had bled in the corners, but the seal, old and cracked, was still visible, still official. A land deed, or what had once passed for one, signed by her dead husband, not his real name. Of course, he'd used an alias to buy time, and the paper, a forgery, good enough to fool a drunk judge in a backwater town, but not a real court. She placed it on the table between them. The rancher glanced at it, eyes steady. Didn't touch it, didn't ask. "It was fake," she said finally. "He told me it was ours, that it meant we had something that couldn't be taken. Said he'd signed it for me." Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. He lied. It was forged from another claim, a dead man's. That's why Garrett got involved, why we were always looking over our shoulders. She paused, looked down. "I kept it anyway." Still, he said nothing. Then, "Why show it to me now?" She folded the paper again, slower this time. "Because Garrett will come back, with new claims, with a badge maybe, with the right judge in his pocket." She set the bundle aside. "And I'm tired of hiding." He turned to face her, arms crossed loosely. "I'll take you to Prescott." She blinked. "Why?" "Not to fight it," he said, "and not to prove anything to him." He stepped closer, then pulled a drawer open and took out a small ink tin and a long, flat envelope. "It's to put your name down right. So when they ask who you are, you don't have to whisper it or borrow it." She stared. "And if I don't want to write it?" she asked. He looked up. "Then we ride anyway, just so you know you can." He left the envelope on the table and went out to the barn. She stayed seated, stared at the deed again. The lies in the ink. The kind of lies that used to cost her sleep, cost her skin. Then she folded it once more, tighter this time. Not to save it, but to put it away for good. When she opened the drawer of her own, she took out a satchel. stitched shut since early winter. Inside were the few things she hadn't thrown away: a picture torn at the edge, a kerchief with blood dried at one corner, and a single silver hairpin. She placed them back in the bag and set it by the door. Then she looked out the window and saw him saddling Smoke, his hands moving in practiced rhythm, his breath coming slow in the morning frost. And in the yard, just beyond the fence, a bluebird landed on the railing, first she'd seen in weeks. She didn't smile, but she stood straighter. By dawn they were packed. He gave her the map, let her hold it, choose the trail. Not as a guide, but as a choice. No fast rides, no danger, just a trip toward her own name. She rode with the satchel tied behind the saddle, her boots tucked firm in the stirrups. And when they passed the marker at the bend, the one that marked the border between the old territory and the new, she reached back, untied the satchel, and let the old deed slip out, one page at a time. Let the wind take it, let the ink scatter, let that name, the one that was never hers, stay buried with the trail behind them. Part 10. Nobody asked if she cried in court. Prescott's courthouse sat high on a hill, a solid stone structure with wide stairs and weathered flags that flapped half-heartedly in the dry spring wind. From a distance, it looked like justice might live there. Up close, it looked more like a man trying to stand tall long after his spine gave out. They arrived mid-morning, boots dusted, coats still holding the chill of mountain air. She didn't look up at the courthouse. She looked at the stairs. He offered a hand. She didn't take it, but she climbed one step at a time, without slowing, without looking back. Inside, the air smelled like paper and floor wax. Judges, clerks, the rustle of too many papers and not enough truth. They sat in the back row, waiting, her satchel rested by her feet, not stitched shut anymore. She didn't touch it, just kept her hands folded in her lap, thumbs tracing over knuckles gone white. Garrett came in late, dressed finer than usual, collar stiff, boots shined, like a man who had borrowed money just to look like he hadn't lost any. He looked straight at her as he passed and smiled, not cruelly, not kindly, just smug. The kind of smile that comes from thinking a woman has no voice left. The judge was an older man, lines on his face from too many liars, not enough time. He squinted down at the papers, then up at Garrett, then finally toward her. Mr. Garrett, the clerk read, claims legal hold on one Lou Ellen Morrow as part of debt inheritance following the late Nathaniel Morrow, per contract signed. She signed that paper under duress, the rancher said, voice quiet but firm. The judge raised a brow. Who are you? Witness, he replied, and the man who was there when she was sold like a mule. Objection, Garrett barked, rising. He has no standing, he's... The judge lifted a hand. Sit down, Mr. Garrett. Garrett sat. The judge turned back to her. Do you have proof, Mrs. Morrow? She reached down, lifted the satchel, opened it, pulled out 2 items. 1, the real deed. Not the forged paper her husband once handed her, but a notarized statement of withdrawal from the property in question, filed after his death by a traveling notary who'd later gone blind, but not before he told a clerk what he'd seen. 2, a letter, handwritten, signed, from a ranch hand named Elmer Cray, long gone now, but whose limp had come from Garrett's boot back in '93. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She handed both to the clerk without a word. The room was quiet, the kind that felt like 100 eyes waiting to blink. The judge skimmed the papers, eyes narrowing. He passed them to the clerk, whispered something, then looked up. You're not owed, he said to Garrett. You never were. But you forged contracts, you threatened her, and from what I see here, you lied to this court. But she's... The judge's voice. dropped low. "She's free to go." Garrett stood, fuming, his mouth opened again. This time, the rancher stood, didn't say a word, just stepped once between Garrett and her, not angry, not warning, just certain. Garrett saw something in that stillness and sat back down. The gavel didn't slam. The judge didn't smile. No one clapped. That's not how things end in real life. But she stood, and the rancher put his hand gently, just once, on her shoulder. Not to claim her, not to lead her, just so she knew she wasn't alone in that room. They walked out together, past Garrett, who didn't turn to look, past the clerk, who gave her a small nod, down the steps, into the light. She didn't cry. Nobody asked if she did. Outside, on the far side of the courtyard, a girl was selling flowers out of a crate. Sunflowers, bent but bright. She stopped and bought one, not for meaning, just to feel the weight of something that hadn't been taken. The rancher didn't speak, just watched her hold the flower stem in both hands, like it might crumble if she gripped too tight. They walked slow to the horses. Before mounting, she looked back at the courthouse, just once, and then she tossed the flower in the street, let it fall where it may, because she didn't need it anymore, not the symbol, not the softness. She had herself now, and that was more than she'd ever had before. Part 11, a place to hang her winter scarf. They rode home slowly. No hurry. The road from Prescott wound between cliffs and sage, past dry creeks that hadn't seen water in weeks, past fence posts gnawed thin by time, the kind of trail where silence had more to say than talk ever could. She didn't say a word the first hour. Neither did he. Not because there was tension, because there wasn't. The wind had teeth in it, though spring was coming. Bits of snow still clung to the edges of the road like old regrets, fading but not yet gone. She wore the same scarf from the day she was sold. Wool, once white, now the color of worn-out bone. She'd kept it looped tight that morning, habit more than need. It smelled like old firewood, like the bottom of saddlebags, like something you keep out of duty, not comfort. At the rise above the ranch, they stopped. Below, the house leaned in the same direction it always had. The smoke curled out the chimney, lazy-like, thin as a promise but steady. Home, if such a word had room for people like them. They rode down without speaking, horses clopping over gravel and dead grass. At the corral, he dismounted first, took her reins without asking. Not as a command, just a courtesy. She lingered near the porch. That scarf, that ragged, burdensome thing, weighed heavier now than when she'd left. It wasn't winter anymore, not really, and maybe, just maybe, she didn't need to keep wearing the memory of what she'd survived. She stepped inside. The house smelled like pine and dry heat. Nothing had changed. Still the same cupboard, still the same old table with its nicked corners, the same tin kettle resting like it had waited on them all this time. She pulled the scarf from her neck and held it a moment in her hand. Then she stepped back onto the porch and looked at the doorframe. There, beside the coat hook, a single nail. She looped the scarf over it. Didn't fold it pretty, didn't straighten the ends. Just left it there. Then went inside and sat. He came in a few minutes later, carrying a small block of wood in his palm, edges sanded smooth. He didn't say anything, just set it on the table in front of her. A piece of wood, no bigger than a biscuit. But on it, carved by hand, one word. Room. She looked up. He didn't meet her eyes. Just moved toward the stove, filled the kettle, lit the fire. She held the block of wood for a long time, turned it over once, felt the weight of it. Light but solid. It wasn't a declaration, wasn't a promise, but it was the first thing in a long time someone had made for her, not out of pity, not out of barter, just because she existed. and that was enough. Later that evening, she stood in the kitchen, fingers tracing the shelf edges, scanning the rows of cracked plates and dented cans like they were old photographs. The cupboard hadn't changed, but something inside her had. She opened the drawer beneath the kettle and pulled out a spare tin cup, one that hadn't been used in years, maybe never. Rinsed it, dried it, then set it down next to his cup. Not opposite, not separate, just beside it. Same shelf, same height. No claim made, no need for one. The scarf hung on the wall, the cup rested on the shelf, and that night, when she went to bed, she didn't close the door all the way. Didn't feel the need. There was a fire still burning in the hearth, faint orange light brushing against the wood like it belonged there. She curled under the blanket and let herself rest. Not sleep from exhaustion, not collapse from running, just rest, the kind a person does when they don't expect to be moved again in the morning. Part 12. The fire's still going and there's vanilla in the bread. He woke to warmth, not light. The fire hadn't gone out. Not entirely. It had settled into that quiet glow, the kind that keeps a room breathing, even when the world outside forgets the sun. And there was a smell in the air, faint, sweet. It didn't belong to the ranch. Not in the usual sense. This wasn't smoke or dust or leather. This was soft, familiar in a way that nudged old memories from places he didn't visit often. He sat up slow, blanket draped at his waist, listened. There it was. The faint rustle of cloth, a clink of tin, nothing loud. Just the house, gently, lived in. He stood, pulled on his shirt, and stepped barefoot down the hall. In the kitchen, she was there, already moving like the morning had called her name. She wore a gray dress, sleeves rolled up, apron dusted with flour, her hair tied back with a strip of fabric, not the old scarf, something new, or maybe just something chosen. On the table was a wooden bowl, half filled with batter. She'd made a small dent in the top, like pressing a secret into it before baking. The smell grew clearer. Vanilla, maybe almond too. He stood in the doorway, not saying anything. She noticed him but didn't jump, just smiled a little, wiped her hands. "I used to make this," she said, her voice still carrying that worn edge, soft-spoken, but not timid. "When I was a girl." He walked to the table, leaned on one hand, waited. She glanced at him, then turned back to the stove, sliding the tin into the oven. It clicked shut. "Never had anyone eat it with me," she added. He didn't answer right away, just reached for the kettle, poured 2 cups, and set them on the table. One in front of him, one in front of her. That was his reply. They sat together, not speaking, not needing to. Steam rose. Fire cracked. Outside, snow had melted to mud and grass was thinking about growing again. The scent of baking bread filled the space between them. It wasn't like the first cornbread she'd made. Back then it was survival. Today it was offering, a way of saying, "This is a thing I remember. This is a thing I can still give." And he accepted it. The silence didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like rest. He looked at her hands, dusted white, nails short, knuckles dry. Hands that had worked hard and been hurt harder. But today they moved without flinching. They moved with purpose. After a while, the bread came out. She cut it slow, served it warm, didn't ask if he liked it, didn't wait for praise. And he didn't offer any. Just ate, slow, steady, the way a man eats something that deserves more than hunger. She took the cup he'd set for her, lifted it to her lips, and for the first time didn't sip like someone expecting to be interrupted. Just drank. Later he stepped outside, whittled a splinter from the porch rail, ran his thumb along the edge of the axe handle. He'd been meaning to fix. The chores could wait. inside, she moved through the house without watching her own steps. She didn't keep one hand on her satchel, didn't glance at the door every time the wind shifted. The scarf still hung there, limp and quiet. The tin cup stayed on the shelf beside his. Two things no one asked her to place, and no one would move. That night, before bed, he passed by the kitchen and paused. She had laid out flour again, covered a bowl, planning to bake more tomorrow. He didn't say anything, just nodded once. And in the still of that warm wooden house, one truth settled in deeper than snow ever had. Some things don't need a name to be real. Part 13. No rings, just a choice to stay. Spring never announced itself out here. It didn't come in with blossoms or parades of color. It just slipped in one dawn at a time. A little less. Frost on the ground, a bird or two with something to say, and the way wind started to carry smells of water instead of snow. The change didn't shout, but it stayed, and so did she. The scarf remained by the door. The tin cup never moved from its place beside the kettle, and every morning 2 cups were poured. No one called it routine, but neither reached for a third. Out past the barn, where the land dipped before it rose again toward the bluffs, she dug small rows into the softening dirt. Carrots, maybe, a handful of beans, nothing ambitious, just enough to try. He'd walk by, axe over his shoulder or fence wire in his hands, and pause without saying much, just watching. One morning she scratched something along the pantry wall with a bit of charcoal. Not drawings or words, just short lines side by side. He looked at them once, never asked. A week later he found her mending one of his old shirts. She hadn't asked permission, just saw the threadbare seam and began. "Not that it's mine to fix," she said. He grunted. "You wear it sometimes, that counts." She didn't smile, but her stitching slowed, not from hesitation but care. Later that week, after mending a strip of rain gutter above the porch, he found a small wrapped bundle beside his tools. Inside, a folded piece of canvas and a whetstone. She'd oiled the blade of his knife, without asking. No note. No thank you expected. Just a quiet message. "I see what you carry. Let me help carry it too." Then came the evening she brought something to him directly. He was by the shed, sanding down a handle for a hoe, whose neck had cracked in winter freeze. The smell of cedar was sharp in the air. She approached with bare feet, the hem of her dress brushing dust, held something in her palm, a knife, small, old, balanced just right. "I used to keep this," she said, and her voice was clearer than usual. "In my boot." He looked down at it, then back up. "Not for work?" She shook her head. "For what might come." He didn't touch it yet. Let her keep it a moment longer. "Don't need it now?" he asked. She hesitated, like part of her hadn't fully believed it until he said it aloud, then nodded. "Number not anymore." "Why?" She didn't meet his eyes at first, just looked at the hills beyond, the quiet line of the horizon. "Because I don't live like I'm waiting to run." He took the knife from her, then, careful. Not because it was sharp, but because it had been heavy for a long time. Turned it in his hand, felt the worn grip, the years in it. "Mind if I keep it?" he asked. She shrugged. "It's yours if you want it." And just like that, something passed between them. Not a vow, not a promise, just the steadiness of two people not backing away. He sheathed the blade, tucked it into the inside wall of the shed where he'd see it each morning. Then he looked at her again. No ring, no declaration, but the sky above them was soft, and the wind didn't carry dust anymore. The ground had thawed, and so had something else. Part 14. Staying isn't winning, it's choosing to be here. Morning came soft, not with fanfare, not with songbirds or golden light streaking through clouds, just the kind of morning that didn't bite at your fingers when you opened the door, the kind that made a man pause on the porch and take a longer breath, like something inside him had thawed enough to remember how. He was already out there, boots planted firm on the warped boards, a tin mug cupped in both hands. Coffee steam rose slow in the stillness. She stepped out a little later carrying the tray she'd carved out of an old cupboard door. Nothing fancy, just sanded wood and 4 seed pouches sitting neatly across it. Lettuce, onions, something called catmint she'd bartered for in town without telling him. She didn't speak, just sat down beside him, letting the quiet settle like a blanket around them both. The air had a whisper of green in it, not strong, not loud, but it was there. He sipped. She folded her hands on the tray. For a long time they just watched the horizon. It wasn't much of a view. Scrub brush, a split-rail fence needing mending, a field they hadn't quite decided whether to plow or let grow wild. But it was theirs, or close enough. He didn't ask what the seeds were for. She didn't ask what he was thinking. That was the thing about folks who'd stayed silent too long. When they finally found someone who didn't fill up the space just to prove they could, they held on. She tied her hair back with the strip of cloth she used on the windier days. He pulled his knife, her old one, the one she'd given up, and began shaving down the splintered handle of the broken hoe he'd been meaning to fix. They sat like that for a while. Not lovers wrapped in passion. Not strangers anymore either. Something else. Something steadier. He paused his carving and looked over. "You figure out where you'll put the catmint?" he asked. She smiled. A quiet thing, barely more than a breath. "Near the back fence, where the rabbits come through. Rabbits'll eat it." "I know." They didn't laugh, but the air felt lighter between them now. There'd be chores to do. The roof still leaked in the corner above the pantry. The mare was expecting again, and the well pump groaned too much for a thing not rusted, but not yet. Right now it was enough to sit. 2 cups, 1 tray. The porch holding the weight of them both. Somewhere behind them, a loose board on the screen door flapped once, then stilled. She looked at him. "Do you regret it?" she asked, voice low. He didn't ask what it meant, just let the question settle like dust before giving it room to breathe. "No," he said. And that was it. No grand speech, no poetic answer. But she nodded like it was the only thing she needed to hear. Behind the barn, the black gelding shifted in the corral. Beyond that, wind stirred the edge of the garden plot, carrying with it the soft scent of dirt just beginning to wake. She leaned her elbow against the porch rail, chin in her hand. They didn't speak again, didn't need to, because staying, truly staying, isn't something you shout. It's something you choose, not just once, but every morning. And that morning, beneath the soft breath of a spring wind, they chose again, and would tomorrow. She wasn't rescued. He wasn't looking to save anyone. But out there, on a piece of land with no fences and a door that didn't lock, 2 people who had both been hurt found a reason to stay. No vows, no big words. Just 2 tin cups on a wooden table, side by side each morning. And a silence that finally meant peace. If this story made you feel something, even just a little, leave a sign in the dust below. Not for us, but for the ones who are still out there, waiting for someone who won't turn away.